Picture this. So, it's midnight in a medieval village. The fire has long since died. 10 people sleep in one room. Children, grandparents, servants, a goat tied near the hearth. Somewhere in the dark, a husband reaches for his wife. Slowly, silently. There are no walls, no bedsheets, no privacy, just a pile of straw and the weight of everyone listening. So how did love survive in a world where there was nowhere to be alone? And when the body still yearned, when desire whispered louder than shame, where did intimacy go to hide? There were no bedrooms. In most medieval homes, even the word room was a luxury. What we'd call a single room today was often the entire house. A packed rectangle of wood and daub, or, in northern lands, a dark longhouse of stone, turf or wattle, with a central fire pit and a hole in the roof for smoke. Inside lived everyone. Parents, children, grandparents, maybe a cousin, maybe a servant, maybe a cow. The bed? A shared mattress of straw, laid on wooden slats, or sometimes just the floor, covered with coarse wool, no pillows, no partitions, and certainly no doors to shut. According to 13th century land records, the majority of English peasants lived in homes with one heated space. These were called aula, open halls. Probate inventories describe one bed for all as normal, not exceptional. Day and night blurred together. A table by day became a bed by night. Children were wrapped in the same blankets that covered their parents, and in winter the family huddled close, not for comfort, but for survival. There was no privacy. There was barely room to stretch. And yet, this was the stage on which marriage was lived. Where love tried to breathe in stale air and couples tried to find each other in the dark, marriage did not come with solitude. It came with company. Even after wedding vows were spoken and meals shared, the first night of marriage rarely meant privacy. In fact, it was often the opposite. Some communities even watched. Ceremonial bedding customs required witnesses to see the couple to bed, to confirm consummation. But for most, intimacy had no ceremony, just obstacles. In court records from 14th century Yorkshire, a wife was accused of lying with her husband behind the bread oven because her family home had no other space. In another case from Essex, a servant claimed she overheard her master and mistress each night without fail, separated by only a hanging cloth. Sexual relations, expected within marriage, had to be timed, hidden, or endured silently. Parents waited until children slept, or until the room fell quiet. Some waited for market days, when the house would briefly empty. Others did not wait at all. As church teaching demanded the marriage debt be paid regularly, many couples did what they could, with blankets pulled high, voices low, and a silent understanding that everyone else heard everything. In one sense, love was never alone. In another, it was never free. When you can't build a wall, you hang a curtain. In homes where timber was scarce and stone was cold, fabric became the only barrier between body and gaze. These weren't delicate veils, they were thick woolen cloths, sometimes patched, sometimes lined with fur, strung across beams or nailed into rafters. They didn't block sound, but they created the illusion of space. For couples, even a thin partition meant something, a place to undress, to speak softly, to reach out without a dozen eyes staring. By the 15th century, wealthier peasants listed bed curtains in their household inventories, alongside cooking pots and tools, proof that privacy was valued, even if rare. In towns, apprentices often shared sleeping quarters, but the master and his wife claimed the only curtained bed. The four-poster bed, with heavy drapes on all sides, became more than a piece of furniture. It was a room within a room, a cave of warmth, a space where touch and breath could belong to 2 people, not 10. Still, most families made do with less. A curtain over a corner, a blanket pinned to a beam, a screen of bundled reeds. It wasn't about blocking out others, it was about holding in something of their own. In a world where space was shared, privacy was an act of invention. Intimacy in the medieval home was not spontaneous, it was strategized. Couples learned to read the rhythm of the room, when the baby was asleep, when the neighbour had gone to market, when the fire was low, and footsteps outside had faded. Silence became a tool, a language, a promise. Words were risky, but a glance, a shared look at dusk, that was enough. Some left small signs. A turned-up shoe, a lantern placed in a certain spot to signal readiness, or caution. In households with servants, one might feign illness to send them away. Others waited for tasks to scatter the family, fetching water, tending animals, collecting kindling. In regions with outbuildings, barns, bakehouses, store huts, short escapes were possible. These became secret havens. A corner behind sacks of barley, a shadowed wall near the coop. They weren't romantic, they were stolen. Moments carved from noise and motion. And then there was timing. In winter, darkness fell early. The house quieted sooner. People slept longer, and in that slow descent into cold and stillness, couples found their narrow window. No doors, no locks, but still somehow a flicker of privacy survived, just long enough. In matters of intimacy, class changed everything. For the poor, the one-room house was the only world they knew. There were no spare chambers, no separate beds, no choice. Privacy was a fantasy. But for the wealthier, minor lords, merchants, prosperous yeomen, privacy became a marker of status. By the late medieval period, some homes included a sola, an upper room reserved for sleeping away from the main hall. There the lord and lady could retreat. A door, a lock, even a chimney, and perhaps, for the first time, a space where love could unfold without witnesses. Inventories from 14th century Kent show the separate bedchambers with curtains, linen sheets, and even small chests for personal items. In contrast, the cotter and the villain still slept by the hearth, beside the cradle, under a thatched roof. In monasteries and nunneries, intimacy was forbidden, yet hidden corners and confessionals still tell silent stories. Even in castles, where nobles had rooms, walls were thin, servants listened, gossip travelled, and so privacy was never absolute. It was scaled, shaped, bought. A fire could warm a chamber, and only wealth could silence the rest of the house. What happens when even curtains fail? You leave the house. Many couples, especially young or unmarried, sought privacy where no one lived, in barns, bakehouses, or the forest's edge. Places where the cold bit hard but no one watched. Church records speak of sin committed near the stables, or fleshly acts behind the mill wall. These weren't tales of romance, they were the only options left. In some villages, guards who patrolled at night caught lovers in fields, under trees, behind hedges. Punishment followed. Fines, whippings, shame, yet the behaviour continued. For married couples, it wasn't always sin, it was survival. If a home was too full, too loud, too narrow, then love had to travel, even if that meant mud, or hay, or the bitter wind of early spring. One 15th century record from Norfolk tells of a couple who lay together on a sack of wheat behind the granary door while the house was filled with guests. The details are stark, and yet quietly heroic, because in a world built against privacy, every act of closeness was an act of defiance. Medieval intimacy was never just a private matter, it was regulated, observed, judged. The church spoke often of sex, but rarely of love. Within marriage, intimacy was permitted, even expected, but only for procreation. Desire without intent to conceive? Suspicious. Lust, even between spouses? Dangerous. Confession manuals from the 13th century instructed priests to ask couples whether they had embraced with excessive fondness or spoken wanton words while others slept nearby. Guilt was measured not only by action, but by setting. The law added pressure. Fornication, adultery, even unseemly behaviour could be brought before ecclesiastical courts, and these courts thrived on what others heard. In one Norwich record from 1442, a neighbour testified that a couple were joined after dark while her mother snored. In another, a maid described the boards creaking and laughter behind the cloth. Homes had thin walls, floors creaked, and people listened. Sometimes it was malice, sometimes curiosity, but always someone new. And so intimacy was never just between two, it was a quiet rebellion, against judgment, against shame, against the ever-present ear pressed to the timber wall. But in the end, the night offered something rare, not privacy, but mercy, when the candles burned out, when voices faded into sleep, when the cold settled and the dark pressed close, then the world forgot. There, in silence, couples found slivers of tenderness. A hand slipped into another. A breath warmed against a neck. Words whispered so softly even the mice beneath the straw couldn't hear. No one saw, no one judged, not the priest, not the children, not even God, perhaps. These weren't grand passions, they were small mercies, moments that made the struggle worth bearing. A husband kissed his wife's fingers as frost gathered on the window. A mother reached across the straw to where her partner lay just to know he was still there. There in that hush love endured. Not with fire, not with poetry, but with patience and stillness. And the darkness for once kept its promise to cover, not condemn. Privacy didn't arrive overnight. It crept in like heat through a long, cold wall. By the late 16th century, change was visible in blueprints. In wealthier households, the one-room structure gave way to separate chambers, a hall for guests, a kitchen for work, a bedroom for sleep. And sometimes even a second room called the withdrawing room meant to pull away from company. Architecture began to reflect intimacy. Walls were built not just for shelter but for silence. In towns, multi-story homes emerged. Sleeping areas moved upstairs. Fireplaces were added to bedrooms. Shutters thickened. Doors began to lock. For the poor, change came slower. Rural homes remained crowded. But even there, small steps appeared. Fabric partitions, corner beds, wooden screens, chimneys reduced smoke. Brick replaced wattle. Glass, once rare, began to close the open window. And as privacy became structure, intimacy found a new place to breathe. Without shame, without witness, without interruption. A shift not just in space, but in what love was allowed to be. So how did couples find intimacy in one-room homes? They didn't wait for space, they made it. They carved out privacy with curtains, with glances, with the rhythm of daily life. They held hands behind woven mats, whispered under blankets, loved without doors or distance. And somehow, despite the cold, the noise, the constant nearness of others, they loved deeply, quietly, persistently. Not because they had privacy, but because they needed each other more than they needed comfort. Love didn't thrive in those homes because the conditions were ideal. It survived because two people chose to see only each other, even with the world around them. And maybe, in some ways, that's what made it last. So the next time you close your bedroom door, or turn on soft music, or dim the light just enough, remember them, the ones who had none of it, and still found a way. I've always believed that silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of things too sacred to speak aloud. When I look back at those one-room homes, dark, crowded, cold, I don't see poverty. I see people making space for each other when there was no space to give, a touch when no one could look, a breath when the walls pressed in, a promise spoken without words. In our world today, we can close a door, we can switch off a light, but too often we close the heart as well. Those couples, long gone, knew a different way. They loved not despite discomfort, but through it. And I wonder if that's the kind of love that survives longest. Not loud, not grand, just quiet and constant. Two people holding on to each other, even when the world gave them no room.